The bidding paddle in Callie Ransom's lap had a crack down the handle. She kept running her thumb over it because it gave her hands something to do that wasn't shaking. 3 years. She had rehearsed this morning 100 times in her head, and none of the rehearsals had a folding chair that squeaked every time she shifted her weight, or a fluorescent light over lot 14 that buzzed on a half-second delay like it couldn't decide whether to stay lit. She sat in the back row of the surplus auction hall, coat still buttoned, and watched a man in a windbreaker sell off filing cabinets, a generator, a stack of unused stretchers. She was here for one thing, a collar. The auctioneer's assistant had confirmed it over the phone 2 weeks ago. Lot 22, personal effects, K9 unit, Staff Sergeant the 1000th, Ransom, deceased. A leather training collar with a brass tag, cataloged along with everything else that hadn't gone home with the family because nobody had asked. Callie hadn't asked. For 3 years she had told herself that not asking was a kind of respect. Her father had given his life, doing something the country needed. You didn't demand paperwork for a thing like that. You said thank you, and you closed the door. She hadn't opened that door once. The folder the notification officer left on her kitchen table stayed sealed, same as the casket she was told, gently, firmly, not to view. She had learned to live around the shape of the question instead of asking it. Lot 19, the auctioneer said, and Callie's eyes went, without her permission, to the side aisle where a handler in a khaki vest stood with a leash in each hand. 2 dogs. Both retired K9, both gray around the muzzle, both watching the room with the flat patience of animals who had done this before and did not enjoy it. She hadn't expected there to be dogs. Nobody had mentioned dogs on the phone, and nobody had mentioned dogs in the printed catalog she'd skimmed twice in the parking lot before working up the nerve to walk in. A woman 2 rows up leaned toward her husband. "They sell the dogs too. That's a shame." Callie's throat went tight. She didn't say anything. She watched the 2 dogs sit, watched a 3rd and 4th get let out from a side door, 4 total now, lined along the aisle wall, leashes looped over a metal rail, and she thought about the sound her father used to make in the garage, low and short, before every one of the dogs he'd worked with in 20 years would drop into a sit like their legs had been cut from under them. She hadn't heard that sound in 3 years. She hadn't let herself think it. Lot 22 came up 40 minutes later, a folding table. A cardboard box with a typed inventory sheet taped to the side. The auctioneer's assistant lifted the collar out with 2 fingers, held it up for the room like it was worth admiring, and Callie stood before she decided to stand. "Excuse me." Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. She cleared her throat, tried again, walking toward the aisle where the assistant stood. "That's my father's. I called ahead. I have the confirmation number. I just need to know if I can pay now or—" The assistant blinked at her, polite and blank. "Sure, who's the—" "Marcus Ransom," Callie said. "Staff Sergeant Marcus Ransom, Mac." She said his name the way she always did in her head, low and quick, like getting a hard word over with. For 1 second nothing happened. Then the sound came, 4 leashes snapping taut at once, 4 bodies rising off the concrete floor in a single motion, ears up, spines straight, eyes locked on her like she had fired a shot. The metal rail rattled. Somewhere a folding chair scraped back. The auctioneer stopped mid-sentence, gavel still in the air. 200 people in that hall went silent at the same moment, and every one of them was looking at Callie. She stood frozen between the aisle and the table, one hand still half raised toward the collar, and across the room, a gray-haired man in a pressed blazer was already moving toward her, fast, for a man his age, the corners of his mouth pulled up while his eyes stayed fixed on the dogs. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry. Let's step this way, all right?" The man's hand hovered near her elbow without touching it, steering by suggestion alone. He had the kind of voice that had spent decades giving orders and had learned late in life to sand the edges off it. A laminated badge on his blazer read Commander E. Voigt, Ret, Volunteer Coordinator. "They get keyed up around crowds," he said. "Old habits, nothing to worry about." Callie let herself be moved 3 steps before her feet planted. "They stood up when I said a name." Dogs react to all kinds of things, sudden movement, a raised voice. He smiled again, and again it stopped at his cheekbones. Loud rooms aren't good for them. We try to keep visitors back from the holding area, for their safety and yours." "I wasn't loud." "No," he agreed too quickly. "No, you weren't." He walked her toward the folding table where the collar still sat, and for a moment his attention split, half on Callie, half on the 4 dogs still standing at the rail, ears forward, watching her go. One of them, the smallest, let out a single low sound, not quite a bark, that made the handler in the khaki vest tighten his grip on the leashes. "You said your father was Sergeant Ransom." Voight's tone had gone careful now, the way people got careful around hospital beds. "I knew Mac, good man. Damn good handler." A pause, exactly 1 beat too long. "Terrible thing, what happened to him? Training accident." "Those things happen more than people think, even to the best of us." Callie had heard the phrase training accident so many times in 3 years that it had stopped meaning anything. The way a word repeated aloud too many times starts to sound foreign in your own mouth. But something in the way Voight said it now, fast, flat, already moving past it, made her look at him properly for the first time. "When was his last day out with them?" she asked. "The dogs, before it happened." "Oh." Voight's eyes flicked, just barely, toward the rail. "Spring, late spring I believe, April sometime." "He wrote me in March," Callie said. "Said he'd just come off a 2-week field rotation with all 4 of them. Said Tank had a limp he was babying. Memory's not what it used to be." Voight laughed, a short dry sound with no air behind it. "Forgive an old man. You said you wanted the collar. Let's get you squared away, get you out of this crowd, HM?" He steered her past a table of surplus radios, never once bringing her within 20 feet of the holding pen again, angling his own body between her and the rail every time the path threatened to bring them close. He was already reaching for the cardboard box, already turning his shoulder to block her view of the dogs, and Callie let him because she didn't yet have the shape of what she was noticing, only the outline of it, the way you feel a splinter before you find it. She paid for lot 22 in cash, counted out by a woman at a card table who barely looked up from her ledger. She signed a receipt on a clipboard with a pen that skipped twice before it caught. She held the collar in both hands afterward, out near the exit doors where the light was better, and ran her thumb over the leather until she found, stamped into the underside where nobody bothered polishing, a string of numbers that meant nothing to her. K7714 DR. Not a serial number she recognized from anything her father had ever shown her, not a tag number, not a unit code, not the kind of catalog string the auction house had used on every other lot in the building. Those were all printed, machine-stamped, uniform. This one had been pressed in by hand, unevenly, the kind of thing a person does with a tool in their own garage, late at night, for a reason that mattered to nobody but them. She wrote it on the back of her receipt before she could talk herself out of the impulse, folded the paper twice, and put it in her coat pocket, like something that might get taken from her if she wasn't careful. Voight walked her almost to the exit before he peeled off toward a side office, promising, with a warmth that didn't sit right on him, to have someone find her if any other personal items surfaced. Callie thanked him. She meant it, the reflex of 3 years of thanking people for small mercies. But she didn't leave. She found a bench along the back wall, out of the main traffic, and sat where she could still see the corner of the holding pen through a gap in the crowd. She watched Voight cross the floor twice more in the next 20 minutes, never quite near the dogs, never quite near her, always somewhere that let him see both. A man that careful about where he stood was a man keeping track of something. She thought about her father's memorial, closed casket, flag folded into a tight triangle, and pressed into her hands by someone she'd never met before or since. She remembered the particular texture of that afternoon, the folding chairs set out on wet grass, a bugler who'd played slightly flat, her mother's hand gripping hers so hard it left marks. She thought about the officer who'd told her, gently, that viewing wasn't recommended, that it was better to remember him as he was. She had nodded. She had said thank you. She had spent 3 years being grateful in the particular silence of a woman who had decided asking questions was a kind of ingratitude to the dead. She looked down at the collar in her lap, at the worn groove along the inside, where a dog's neck had pressed against it 1,000 times, and thought about how an object could carry a shape long after the thing that shaped it was gone. Her father's hands had buckled and unbuckled this exact strip of leather more mornings than she could count. That felt like more truth than anything printed on official letterhead ever had. Somewhere in this building, there was a folder with her father's name on it, an official record of the day he died. She had never asked to see it, had told the notification officer 3 years ago that she trusted them, that she didn't need details, that some things were better left closed. She stood up, collar still in one hand, and started toward the administration office at the far end of the hall, where a hand-lettered sign read "Records Requests" in blue marker on a strip of masking tape. She had never once, in 3 years, asked to see how her father actually died. She was about to. The records office was a converted supply closet with a desk crammed against the far wall and a woman behind it named Deb, according to the nameplate propped against a coffee mug that read "World's Okayest Admin." Request forms right there. Deb didn't look up from her screen. Takes about 10 minutes if the file's digitized, longer if we have to pull the box. Callie filled out the form with a pen chained to the desk. Name, relationship, deceased's full name and rank. She wrote Marcus T. Ransom, Staff Sergeant, and felt her hand slow down on the last letters, like the pen had gotten heavier. Ransom, Deb said, reading upside down out of habit. K9 program. Yes, give me a few. Deb pushed back from the desk. Those files are mixed in with the base closure boxes. Everything from that unit got shuffled when they folded the program 2 years back. Callie sat in the only other chair in the room, a metal folding chair with a rip in the vinyl seat, and waited. The fluorescent light in here buzzed too, a half-tone lower than the one in the auction hall, and she found herself listening to it instead of thinking, because thinking felt dangerous right now, standing this close to a door she had spent 3 years walking past. A calendar on the wall was still turned to a month that had already passed. A space heater under the desk ticked as it cooled, though nobody had turned it off. Deb came back 12 minutes later, dust on the knee of her slacks, from crouching in some back room, carrying a thin manila folder, the kind that had been opened and closed enough times that the corners had gone soft. "Here you go, hun. Photocopies only. Originals stay with us. You can read it here if you want privacy, or I can step out." "Here's fine." Deb stepped out anyway, into the hallway, pretending to check on something at the far end. Callie opened the folder. The first page was a cover sheet, stamped and initialed in 3 places. Incident report, training fatality. She made herself read it slowly, the way you'd cross a floor you didn't trust, 1 word at a time. Location, training field, Section C. Time, 0640 hours. Cause, equipment failure during live fire simulation exercise, resulting in blunt force trauma. She had never read those words before. Nobody had ever said blunt force trauma to her. They had said accident. They had said he didn't suffer. They had said it was fast. Her hands were steady. That surprised her more than anything else in the room. She turned the page and found the timeline, a typed grid, hour by hour, backing out from the moment of death to the start of the exercise the night before. 2200 hours. Unit begins night training rotation. 0130 hours. First break. K9 team rehydrated. 0400 hours. Live fire simulation begins. 0640 hours. Incident. She sat with that grid for a long moment before she understood what was bothering her. Section C. She knew that name, knew it the way you know a street you've driven past 100 times without ever turning down it. Her father used to mail her photographs sometimes, before phones made that unnecessary, snapshots of the training field with a scrawled caption on the back. East Range, one of them had read, in his handwriting, "Dogs earned their lunch today." She had that photograph in a shoebox at home, had looked at it a dozen times over the years without ever once thinking to check it against anything official. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the folded receipt from the collar, the one with the serial number written on the back, because tucked into the fold of that same receipt, she'd forgotten this, hadn't thought about it in 3 years, was the condolence letter. She had carried it in her wallet since the day it arrived, worn soft at the creases, because it was the only piece of paper that had ever felt honest to her. She unfolded it now beside the incident report. The letter, signed by a captain she'd never met, offered condolences for the loss of Staff Sergeant Ransom, killed in the early hours of the 12th during a live-fire training exercise at Fort Callahan's East Range. The incident report in her lap listed the location as Section C, the base's central training field, a 15-minute drive from the East Range, on the opposite side of a supply road. She read both documents again. Then a third time, tracing her finger under each date, each place name, checking she hadn't transposed a number in her own exhaustion. She hadn't. Two official documents told two different stories about where and how her father had spent the last morning of his life. Her stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the specific, cold recognition of being lied to by people who had never expected her to check. She thought of every well-meaning person who had told her over the years that some questions weren't worth asking, that peace came from letting things rest. She wondered, sitting in that hard metal chair, how many of them had actually believed that, and how many had simply repeated what they'd been told to say. She flipped back to the cover sheet, looking now with different eyes, and saw what she'd skimmed past the first time, a line near the bottom, revised November 14th, initialed but not dated with a full signature, sitting directly under the original incident date. The ink of the revision sat slightly darker than the rest of the page, slightly newer, as if it had been added after the fact, and photocopied along with everything else so the seam wouldn't show. She held the page up toward the buzzing light, tilting it slowly. The difference was unmistakable once she was looking for it. One pass of a pen, one careful edit, made by someone who had assumed nobody would ever set this page beside anything else. Someone had gone back into this file and changed something, recently enough that the ink still read fresh under fluorescent light. Callie's hands were not steady anymore. She thought about Voight saying April sometime, thought about the pause before he said it, thought about a man positioning himself in a crowded room so he could watch two things at once without seeming to watch either. She thought about 3 years of being grateful in silence for a story that had never once been checked against itself. The chair scraped as she stood, too fast, knocking her knee against the underside of the desk, and she gathered both papers into the folder with hands that wouldn't quite cooperate, folding the loose pages back together like she could put the last 3 years back the way they'd been before she'd opened this door. She couldn't. Something had shifted permanently in the small closet of a room, in the buzz of a bad fluorescent bulb, in the particular silence of a woman who had just learned that the gratitude she'd built her grief around had been resting on a lie somebody bothered to type twice. She stepped out of the records office, still holding the folder, still catching her breath, thanking Deb on the way past in a voice that came out steadier than she felt, and looked up. At the far end of the hallway, past the row of vending machines and a water fountain that dripped instead of running, Commander Voight stood perfectly still, hands folded in front of him, eyes fixed not on Callie's face but on the folder in her hands, the same folder Deb had pulled from a box of files nobody was supposed to still be checking. He stood rooted at the far end of the hallway, hands folded, eyes locked on the folder in her grip. Callie didn't run. Running would have meant she had something to hide, and right now the only thing she had was a folder full of paper that didn't match itself, and a man at the end of a hallway who apparently already knew that. She walked toward him instead. Slow, unhurried, folder tucked under her arm like any other visitor leaving the records office with routine paperwork. "Find what you needed?" Voight asked, when she was close enough that lowering his voice made sense. "Just background," she said, "for my own peace of mind." Something in his face relaxed, a half-second too visibly, and Callie filed that away too, the way you'd note a footprint in soft ground, not because it told you everything, but because it told you someone had walked there recently and hadn't wanted to be seen walking. "I should get back to the floor," Voight said, and left her standing near the vending machines, with a warmth in his goodbye that had cooled about 10 degrees since the last one. Callie waited until he'd rounded the corner before she let her shoulders drop. Her knees felt unsteady in a way they hadn't been a minute ago, and she put a hand flat against the cool cinderblock wall until the feeling passed. She didn't go back to her car, not yet. She told herself it was practical. She'd already come this far, already paid for the collar, might as well see the rest of the auction through, blend in, look like exactly what she'd come here as, a grieving daughter buying back a keepsake, nothing more. But underneath the practical reasoning sat something else, something that had teeth in it now. If Voight had gone to the trouble of revising a death record, if he was tracking her every move across a crowded auction floor, then whatever he was protecting was still here, still in this building. 4 dogs, standing in a row along a metal rail. She bought a coffee she didn't want from a vendor cart near the loading dock, mostly to have a reason to stand still with a view of the main floor, and drank it slowly while pretending to read a flyer about upcoming government surplus sales in 3 counties she had no plans to visit. The coffee was burnt and lukewarm, and she drank all of it anyway, because it gave her hands a job and her eyes an excuse to keep watching the room without watching any one thing too long. She found her way back to the holding pen from a different angle, past a row of surplus tents, and stood at a respectful distance where the khaki-vested handler wouldn't feel the need to shoo her off. The 4 dogs had settled some since the outburst, 3 of them lying down now, heads on paws, watching the crowd shuffle past with the bored patience of animals who had learned that most of what happened around them didn't concern them. But the smallest one, the one who'd made the low sound earlier, was still sitting upright, still watching the aisle where Callie had said her father's name. "You're the one from earlier," the handler said, not unfriendly, adjusting his grip on the leashes as she came closer. "They still keeping an eye on you. Do they usually settle down faster than this? Usually they're asleep by lunchtime, long day for them, standing around in a loud room." He shrugged. "Not today, I guess." Callie'd grown up around working dogs her whole childhood, knew better than to reach for one without asking, knew the particular stillness a trained animal held when it was deciding whether a stranger was safe. She crouched instead, at a distance, elbows on her knees, and let the dog look at her as long as it wanted. Her father used to make a sound before every command. Not a word first, a click of the tongue, low and short, twice, like tapping a glass to get someone's attention before you spoke. He'd done it since she was small enough to sit on his shoulders at the training field on family days, watching him work a green recruit dog through basic obedience while her mother packed sandwiches at a picnic table 20 yards back. She remembered the smell of sunscreen and cut grass from those afternoons, remembered how proud she'd felt being the only kid in the bleachers whose dad the dogs actually listened to. Callie made the sound now, quiet, barely audible over the noise of the crowd. All 4 dogs' heads came up at once. The smallest one stood, ears forward, weight shifted onto her front paws, like she was waiting for the second half of a command she hadn't heard in 3 years. The handler noticed, glanced over, frowning slightly, hand tightening on the leashes out of instinct, but Callie didn't move, didn't repeat the sound, just watched the dog watch her, and felt something in her chest crack open that she'd kept sealed since the funeral. "How'd you do that?" the handler asked, quieter now, some of the professional flatness gone out of his voice. "I don't know yet," Callie admitted. "I just remembered it. This wasn't coincidence. Dogs didn't hold a stranger's random noise in memory for 3 years and 4 different owners. Whatever these 4 had lived through with her father, it had left a mark deep enough that a half-remembered sound from his daughter's mouth could bring all of them back to their feet. The number on the collar surfaced in her mind, K7714DR, unbidden, and settled next to the sound, like 2 pieces of the same secret. They were the only living witnesses left to whatever had actually happened that morning. And in a few hours, according to the printed program folded in her coat pocket, they would be led out onto the auction floor and sold to the highest bidder, scattered to 4 different homes in 4 different states, and whatever they carried in their memory of Marcus Ransom's last morning would go with them, unreachable, forever. Callie stood, knees stiff from crouching, and made herself a promise she didn't fully understand the size of yet. She was not leaving this building without knowing what these dogs knew, and without making sure Elias Voight didn't get to decide who found out first. She thought briefly of calling her mother. Her thumb hovered over the phone in her coat pocket for a full 10 seconds before she put it back. Her mother had rebuilt an entire life around the version of events she'd been given 3 years ago. A new routine, a support group that met Thursdays, a framed photograph on the mantel with a caption that used the word hero without qualification. Callie wasn't ready to hand her mother a folder full of contradictions until she knew for certain what those contradictions actually meant. Better to be sure first, better to not break something twice. She spent the next hour doing the only thing she could think to do, staying close without looking like she was staying close. She browsed a table of surplus radios she had no use for, turning the dials on a broken shortwave set while a vendor extolled its virtues to nobody in particular. She bought a bottle of water from a cart and drank it slower than any human being had ever needed to drink water. She wandered past a rack of decommissioned uniforms, ran her fingers once over a sleeve patch she recognized, and moved on before the ache in her chest could pull her under. She kept the holding pen in the corner of her eye the whole time, watched 2 more lots sell, watched Voight cross the floor exactly the way he had before, tracking 2 things without seeming to track either, once pausing near the handler's station just long enough to exchange a few clipped words that made the younger man's shoulders tighten before Voight walked on. On her way back from the water cart, she passed close enough to 2 staff members restocking a folding table to catch a fragment of their conversation, pitched low, but not low enough. "He's been in and out of the records room 3 times today," one of them said, a woman in an auction house polo, stacking clipboards. "Never seen him do that. Usually he just signs off on the volunteer sheet and disappears till closing." The other one shrugged and said something about budget season making everybody strange, and they moved on to a different table before Callie could hear anything more. She filed it away with everything else, another small stone added to a pile that was starting to have real weight. She checked her watch twice in the next 10 minutes without meaning to, the way you check a clock in a waiting room when the news could go either way. The auction hall smelled like every surplus sale she'd ever wandered through as a kid trailing behind her father on a Saturday. Machine oil, old canvas, the particular staleness of a building that ran its air conditioning too hard for too many decades. She used to love these smells. Today they just made her aware of how much time was passing. At 2:40, the overhead speaker system crackled to life, feedback squealing once before the auctioneer's voice settled into it. "Folks, we're moving along nicely today. Next up, we've got some smaller lots. Then we'll be bringing our K9 group to the floor in approximately 20 minutes. Lot 31 through 34, 4 retired working dogs, sold together as a unit or separately per buyer request. 20 minutes. Callie's water bottle crumpled slightly in her grip. 20 minutes until 4 leashes were handed over to whoever raised a paddle highest, and every question she had about the revised report, about the mismatched locations, about a sound that made a dog stand at attention after 3 years of silence, would walk out the door with them, gone for good. The auctioneer's assistant led the 4 dogs onto the raised platform at the front of the hall, 1 handler on each side, leashes gathered like reins. Callie found a spot near the front, close enough to see the brass number tags clipped to their collars, 31, 32, 33, 34, replacing, she realized with a small twist in her chest, whatever names they'd carried before the program folded. Retired K9 unit, 4 dogs, ages 6 to 9, temperament tested and cleared for civilian adoption, the auctioneer read from a card. Buyer's choice, take the group or bid on individual dogs. Group discount applies if purchased together. She had left her phone on silent all day, and now, standing at the edge of the platform, she felt it buzz once against her hip, a reminder alert she'd set weeks ago for the exact time the K9 lot was scheduled to go up, a small precaution from a version of herself this morning who hadn't yet known there was anything to be careful about. She silenced it without looking and kept her eyes on the 4 dogs being led up the ramp. The bidding opened low. A young couple near the back raised a paddle for the smallest one, the one who'd stood for Callie twice now, and Callie's stomach lifted with something close to hope, a family, a backyard, a life that had nothing to do with any of this. The husband leaned over and said something to his wife that made her laugh, and for a second Callie let herself imagine it ending there, simply, kindly, with none of what she'd found in that records office mattering to anyone but her. Then a paddle went up near the side aisle, and the number on it climbed past the couple's bid before the auctioneer had even finished calling it, and Callie turned to see who was bidding. Voight. He wasn't looking at the dogs. He was looking straight ahead, paddle raised without hesitation, and when the auctioneer called for a counter, he raised it again before anyone else could. Group of 4, going once at $4,200, nobody else's paddle went up. $4,000 was 3 times what any of the earlier lots had sold for. The young couple exchanged a look and lowered their hands, the husband shrugging an apology toward his wife. A murmur ran through the room, the particular murmur of people watching a number that didn't make sense to them. Group of 4, going twice. Callie's mind raced through everything she knew, trying to find a version of this that made sense. A collector, maybe. Someone sentimental about retired K9s. Except Voight hadn't so much as glanced at the dogs since they'd stepped onto the platform, and a man buying out of sentiment usually looked at what he was buying. She edged closer to the side of the platform, close enough to hear the low exchange between Voight and a younger man in a matching lanyard who'd come to stand beside him, someone from the base liaison office, she guessed, by the badge. "Get them transferred to the special handling program before end of day," Voight was saying, voice pitched for privacy but not quite low enough. "Humane processing protocol, same as the others, no point letting this drag on." "You want me to file it as adoption or as adoption's cleaner on paper?" Voight didn't blink. "Nobody follows up on an adoption. Humane processing protocol." Callie had grown up around enough working dog terminology to know exactly what phrase people reached for when they meant something they didn't want to say plainly. It wasn't a rehoming program. It wasn't a rescue transfer. It was the paperwork term for animals being taken out of circulation permanently, quietly, in a way that closed a file instead of opening a new one. He wasn't buying the dogs to save them. He was buying them to make them disappear. Callie's hands went cold, and her breath caught halfway down her throat, and for one disorienting second, the noise of the auction hall seemed to pull away from her, distant, underwater, the auctioneer's voice thinning to a smear of sound, replaced by something older, einentromdet, the training field at night, floodlights cutting hard white circles into the dark, and a man standing just outside the light, who was not Callie and had never been Callie, watching from a distance he'd chosen because getting closer meant being seen. Petty Officer Denny Okafor had been on shift that night for a reason that had nothing to do with the exercise, a generator check, routine, the kind of task nobody remembered afterward because nothing was supposed to happen during it. The radio chatter turned clipped and wrong, somebody's voice pitched too high for a routine drill. Then Voight's voice, closer than it should have been, giving an order that didn't match the training plan posted on the board that morning. A live fire sequence moved up 2 hours early, run without the safety officer who was supposed to sign off on it. He remembered Mac Ransom's voice on the radio, calm the way Mac was always calm, asking Voight to confirm the change before he took his dogs into position. He remembered the specific, deliberate patience in that voice, a man who had learned long ago that panic never made a bad situation smaller. The confirmation never came. Only the order, again, sharper, cutting through the radio static while the floodlights swung into position and the dogs on the line went tense against their leashes, sensing something in the air before any human on that field did. He stood in the dark at the edge of the floodlights, 38 years old and 3 months into a new posting after a transfer he'd asked for, watching a man twice his rank make a decision that every instinct in his body told him was wrong, and said nothing, did nothing. Told himself, in the particular grammar men use to survive their own cowardice, that it wasn't his place, that senior officers didn't make mistakes like this, that whatever was about to happen wasn't his to stop. The sound afterward was not an explosion, nothing that dramatic. Just the wrong kind of silence, all at once, radios gone quiet, floodlights swinging toward the field, and 4 dogs barking in a pattern he would hear again in his sleep for the next 3 years, a pattern that never quite left him no matter how many nights he tried to drown it out with the television turned up too loud in an empty living room. In the minutes after, Voight crossed the field with his radio still in hand, and his face held not grief, not shock, calculation. He crouched once beside the wreckage, jaw set, eyes already somewhere in the future where this had already been explained away, already rehearsing what he would say in the report. He walked away from that field and never once, in 3 years, told anyone what he'd seen. Not his wife, not the chaplain who'd asked, gently, if he wanted to talk about anything from that deployment, and rarely himself, most nights if he could help it. Somewhere in the space between that field and this auction hall, 3 years had passed without Denny Okafor once saying the words out loud. He had told himself so many versions of why silence was safer that the versions had started to blur together: the mortgage, the daughter's tuition, the particular way a review board could dismantle a career with a single line in a file. He had watched from the parking lot of a hardware store 2 towns over, 6 months ago, as a news segment about the K9 program's closure played on a display television through the window, Mac Ransom's name flashing across the bottom of the screen for 4 seconds before the anchor moved on to weather. He had sat in his truck afterward for 20 minutes without starting the engine. The memory receded as fast as it had come, the auction hall noise flooding back in around Callie, gavel still poised in the auctioneer's raised hand, Voight's paddle still lifted, the number on the board climbing toward a final call nobody was left to contest. Going 3 times, Callie's hand went up without her permission, a half-formed word in her throat that wouldn't quite become a bid because she had no money left. No paddle, no standing in this room to stop a man from buying what he wanted, with cash he clearly had. The room around her had gone strangely quiet in the way rooms do, right before something irreversible happens, 200 strangers holding their breath without knowing why. And Callie realized she was holding hers too. The auctioneer's gavel started its downward arc. And from somewhere near the back of the hall, a voice broke through the room, not loud, but pitched with a weight that made every head turn toward it. 3 years of silence collapsing into 2 words. Wait, please. The man who'd spoken was already walking down the center aisle by the time the room finished turning to look at him, mid-40s, close-cropped hair going gray at the temples, a canvas bag hugged tight against his side like it held something he'd been carrying a long way. His hands were shaking. Not from cold. Denny Okafor had rehearsed 100 versions of this moment over 3 years, and none of them had started with his own voice cracking on the word please. He'd told himself, every one of those years, that silence was the responsible choice. He had a wife, a daughter starting high school, a pension that had taken 20 years to build and could be gone in the time it took a review board to decide he was a liability instead of a witness. He had driven past the base 3 times in the last year alone, each time telling himself he'd go in, each time turning the truck around 2 miles out, sitting on the shoulder of the road with both hands on the wheel until the urge passed. He had watched, from a distance, as the K9 program folded and its dogs got scattered into a system nobody was tracking closely enough to notice one man quietly steering 4 of them toward a paperwork dead end. He had told himself that watching from a distance wasn't the same as doing nothing. He had believed it, most days. A friend at the base liaison desk had texted him the auction date weeks ago, half a courtesy, half a dare. Denny had been tracking the K9 program's closure since the news segment aired. It had taken exactly 1 gavel, poised over 4 leashes he recognized even from the back of the room, to prove him wrong. He had been wrong about that for 3 years, and he knew it the moment he saw the gavel start to fall. I need everyone to hear this before that sale finalizes, Denny said, close enough to the platform now that his voice carried without strain. My name is Denny Okafor. I served with Staff Sergeant Marcus Ransom. I was on that field the night he died, and the report filed on his death is not what happened. The room had gone silent in the particular way that felt less like quiet and more like held breath. Even the auctioneer, gavel still frozen mid-air, seemed unwilling to be the one who broke it first. A few phones had already come up, instinctively, the way phones do now at the first sign that something is about to be worth remembering. Callie turned from where she stood near the platform edge, and for 1 long second she simply looked at him, a stranger's face that somehow already meant everything, the way a name can mean everything before you've met the person attached to it. "Ma'am," Denny said, and it took her a moment to understand he was talking to her. "Are you his daughter?" Callie, her voice came out rough. Callie Ransom. Denny's jaw worked once before he could speak again. I should have found you 3 years ago. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry it took this. He set the canvas bag on the edge of the platform and unzipped it with hands that hadn't fully stopped shaking, pulling out a spiral notebook swollen with age, its cover soft and curled at the corners, water stained along one edge from some long-forgotten spill, and beneath it a small handheld recorder, the kind that took cassette tapes, older than most of the phones in the room. This is my training log from that unit, he said, loud enough now that the auctioneer had lowered his gavel and stepped back, loud enough that Voight, standing frozen near the platform's edge, had gone the particular still that people go when they're calculating how much damage is already done. Every exercise, every schedule change, signed off by the safety officer of record. The night your father died, the live fire sequence was moved up 2 hours without safety clearance. I logged the original schedule that morning, before anyone changed it. I never turned the page in. He held up the recorder next. And this, I kept this in a drawer for 3 years, because I was a coward, and I'm done being one. It's a radio channel I patched into that night, on a handheld I wasn't supposed to have running. You can hear the order being given. You can hear your father asking for confirmation he never got. Callie's hand found the edge of the platform to steady herself. The collar was still in her coat pocket. She could feel the shape of the brass tag through the fabric, and she thought of the number stamped into its underside, the one she'd copied onto the back of a receipt, with no idea what it meant. "There's a number," she said, pulling the folded receipt free, K7714DR, on the collar. "I don't know what it stands for." Denny looked at the paper in her hand, and his shoulders dropped an inch, the tightness he'd carried into the room finally letting go. "Denny Ransom," he said quietly. "DR. "That's not a serial number, ma'am. That's initials, 7714, his badge number and mine, stitched together. Your father had all 4 collars re-tagged the month before he died, after Tank got separated from us during a field exercise and didn't respond to any command from the new handler assigned that week. Mac was worried something like that would happen again if anything ever happened to him. He wanted a failsafe, a command word only he used, something none of the other handlers had ever taught them, so that if one of the dogs ever got lost or handed off wrong, there'd be a way to bring them back to someone who knew it. "The clicking sound," Callie said. "Twice, low." Denny's eyes widened slightly. "He taught you that?" "He did it my whole childhood. I didn't know it meant anything. It's why they stood up when you said his name earlier. Someone told me what happened at the front of the hall an hour ago. Word travels fast in a room like this. They'd have recognized your voice pattern, your cadence, close enough to his to trigger the response even before the sound. He built that response into them on purpose, in case." Denny's voice caught. "In case something happened to him and somebody who loved him needed a way back to them." The nested question that had been sitting unanswered since the first minute of this story, why 4 dogs would rise as one at the sound of a single name, closed itself quietly in the middle of a crowded auction hall, and Callie found she had to press the back of her hand against her mouth to keep from making a sound. Behind Callie, the handler had let 2 of the leashes go slack entirely, and the smallest dog crossed the last few feet of platform on her own, pressing against Callie's leg with the particular weight of an animal that has decided, finally, where it belongs. Voight moved then, stepping up onto the platform with the particular calm of a man trying to reassert control of a room that had already left him behind. "This isn't the place to discuss classified training procedure," he said, and his voice had lost the warmth entirely now, gone flat and hard in a way that finally matched the eyes Callie had noticed from the very first minute he'd approached her. "Miss Ransom, I'd suggest you and your friend take this up through proper channels, not in the middle of a public sale." "The proper channel," Callie said, and her voice, to her own surprise, didn't shake at all, "is right here. In front of everyone who just watched you try to buy 4 witnesses before they could talk." The auction hall's floor manager was a heavy-set man named Griggs, who spent most of a normal Tuesday breaking up arguments over furniture lots, and he clearly had no framework for what was unfolding in front of him now. He climbed onto the platform with his hands raised, palms out, the universal gesture of a man trying to slow a room down before it tipped over. "Folks, let's everybody just take a breath here. Somewhere behind him, the auctioneer had climbed down off the block entirely, gavel abandoned on the podium, watching the unfolding scene with the particular helplessness of a man whose entire skill set had suddenly become irrelevant to the room. "I have documentation," Callie said, and she was surprised at how steady her own voice sounded, how the shaking that had lived in her hands all afternoon had gone somewhere else entirely, replaced by something colder and more useful. She held up the incident report folder in one hand, the condolence letter in the other. "This is my father's official death record. The location listed doesn't match the location in his condolence letter. There's a revision on the file dated over a year after his death, and the man standing next to me just tried to spend $4,000 to make the only living witnesses to that night disappear into a program with no oversight. That's a serious accusation to make in a room full of strangers," Voight said. And he'd found some of his composure again, enough to address the crowd instead of just Callie, enough to make his voice carry with the practiced authority of 30 years giving briefings. "I understand this is an emotional day for you, Miss Ransom. Grief does strange things to people's memory of paperwork they've never actually read before." "I read it 3 times, Callie said. "The dates don't move no matter how many times you read them." A woman near the front, one of the earlier bidders, Callie realized, the one who'd raised a paddle for a filing cabinet 2 hours ago, called out, unprompted, "Let her finish. Let's hear the man's tape." Voight's eyes flicked toward the voice, and for the first time all day, Callie saw something crack in his composure that had nothing to do with her at all, the particular unease of a man who had spent 30 years assuming a room would side with rank, discovering in real time that it wasn't going to. "May I see the file?" Griggs asked, and for a moment it seemed like the simplest possible way through this. Hand it to a neutral party, let someone with no stake in the outcome look at the pages and confirm what was already written on them. Callie held it out, and for one brief, unguarded second she let herself believe the worst of this day might already be behind her. Voight's hand closed over the folder before Griggs's did. "I'll take that," Voight said, and his voice had dropped its briefing room polish entirely now, gone hard and fast, in a way that made the crowd's low murmur cut off all at once. "That's a base personnel record. It shouldn't have left records custody in the first place. That's a chain of custody violation, and I'm not letting a civilian wave classified paperwork around a public auction floor." He pulled. Callie's grip tightened on instinct, 3 years of not asking questions collapsing into one refusal to let go, and for 2 full seconds the folder stretched taut between them, corners bending, a few loose photocopies sliding free and drifting to the platform floor. One page landed near Denny's boot. He crouched, unhurried, and picked it up, holding it against his chest like something that might blow away if he let his guard down. "Let go of it," Callie said. "You don't understand what you're holding." "I understand exactly what I'm holding." Voight's other hand came up, not a strike, nothing that dramatic, but a sharp shove against her shoulder meant to break her grip, enough force that Callie stumbled back a half step and nearly went down off the edge of the low platform. Denny caught her arm before she fell, steadying her, and in the same motion put himself half a step between her and Voight, one hand raised, palm out. "That's enough," Denny said. "That's enough, sir." Callie felt the shove land somewhere past her shoulder, in the same place 3 years of held-back questions had been sitting, and for a strange half-second she wasn't sure if the sound in her ears was her own pulse or the crowd's. For one raw second, it looked like it might tip further. Voight's face had gone a mottled red, his hand still fisted around a corner of torn folder, and the crowd had surged forward into a loose ring around the platform, phones already up, a dozen small screens catching a moment none of them had come to this auction expecting to see. Somewhere behind Callie, one of the 4 dogs let out a single sharp bark, sharp enough to cut through the noise, and the handler dropped to a crouch beside them, murmuring low, trying to keep all 4 from bolting off the rail. But 2 security guards in matching polo shirts, the kind hired for crowd control at events exactly like this, were already pushing through the ring, and Griggs was already shouting for them, and within seconds one had a firm grip on Voight's arm, pulling him back a step, while the other collected the scattered pages off the platform floor with visibly shaking hands. "Sir, I need you to step back," the first guard said. "Now." A second guard moved to Callie's side without being asked, not restraining her, just present, the kind of quiet backup that told her the room had already sorted out who the threat actually was. Voight yanked his arm free of the grip, chest heaving, and for a moment he looked less like a retired commander and more like a man who had just watched the last 30 years of carefully maintained authority come apart in front of 200 strangers with their phones out. He straightened his blazer with 2 sharp tugs, an old habit reasserting itself even now, and when he spoke again his voice had gone quiet in a way that was somehow worse than the shouting. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, to the room, to Griggs, to no one in particular. "I was trying to protect a classified file from mishandling, that's all this was." Griggs, still holding the recovered pages, looked between Voight and the 4 dogs at the rail, and something in his expression suggested he had already made up his mind about who he believed, regardless of what came next on paper. Nobody in the ring around the platform looked convinced. The woman who'd called out earlier folded her arms and shook her head slowly, and the sound of it, no words, just a small, plain gesture of disbelief from a stranger, seemed to land on Voight harder than anything Callie had said. Griggs held up both hands again, this time with the gathered pages pressed flat against his chest like he was afraid to let go of them too. Okay, everybody, the K9 lots are suspended pending verification. Nobody's buying anybody until I get base liaison on the phone and somebody who actually has authority to look at these records." He turned to Callie, and something in his expression had shifted from irritation to something closer to sympathy. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you and this gentleman to stay put while I sort this out, and you," his eyes cut to Voight, held there, "I'd suggest you don't leave either." A woman near the back exit, already on her phone, one hand pressed over her free ear against the noise, was giving someone terse instructions that included the words "incident report" and revised documentation loud enough that a few heads turned toward her too. For a moment, nobody in the ring moved at all, the whole hall holding on the same breath. Voight didn't answer. He looked, for one long moment, at the folder in Griggs's hands, at Denny's canvas bag, at the 4 dogs still standing at the rail with their eyes fixed on Callie, and his shoulders dropped, and his chin fell. Not an admission, not yet, but the slump of a man who had run out of rooms left to control. The auction hall, which 40 minutes ago had been selling filing cabinets and stretchers to a half-attentive crowd, had gone entirely, electrically still. 200 people ringed around a low platform, 4 dogs still standing at their rail with ears forward and eyes fixed on Callie, and in the middle of it, for the first time in 3 years, every eye in the room was turned toward the truth instead of away from it. Callie looked down at the torn folder, now back in Griggs's hands, half its pages loose and out of order, and thought that it had never looked more honest than it did right now, crumpled and incomplete, and finally out in the open where nobody could quietly revise it again. It took 2 hours for base liaison to arrive, a woman named Colonel Priya Adams, who moved through the auction hall with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had untangled worse messes than this one before breakfast. She'd come straight from another appointment, still in a blazer with a lanyard swinging loose, and she claimed a corner of the platform as her workspace without asking anyone's permission, spreading the recovered pages out in order across a folding table someone dragged over for her. She read Denny's training log page by page, pausing twice to ask him to clarify a date, her pen tapping a quiet rhythm against the table edge the whole time. She listened to 11 minutes of scratchy recorder audio through a single earbud, face unreadable, while the crowd, most of them still lingering, unwilling to leave before they learned how this ended, watched from a respectful distance, the auction hall's usual noise replaced by something closer to the hush of a courtroom. She did not look unreadable by the time she finished. She set the earbud down on the folding table, exhaled once through her nose, and reached for a legal pad without saying anything for almost a full minute. "This file is going to Inspector General's office today," she told Callie, holding up the incident report, now paper-clipped instead of torn, someone having gathered its pages back into some kind of order. "Not next week, today. And I owe you an apology on behalf of a system that let a revised record sit unchallenged for over a year." Voight had been asked to remain in Griggs's office at the back of the building, a security guard posted outside the door, not under arrest, not yet, Colonel Adams had explained. That would take time and paperwork of its own, but no longer a free man moving through this crowd with a paddle in his hand. Callie sat on the edge of the platform, the collar back in her coat pocket, Denny beside her, with his canvas bag empty now, everything it held handed over to people with the authority to actually use it. Somewhere behind them, the 4 dogs had been let off their leashes entirely, settled in a loose pile near the rail, no longer watching the crowd, no longer bracing for anything. He confirmed a live fire sequence without safety clearance because he was behind schedule for an inspection the next morning, Denny said quietly, once Colonel Adams had stepped away to make a call. "Your father caught it, radioed to stop, to wait for the safety officer." Voight overruled him. "What happened after that, the report calls it equipment failure. It wasn't equipment." His voice thinned. Mac pushed a junior handler out of the blast radius of a training charge that shouldn't have been live yet. That's what killed him, not an accident, not bad luck. He was covering for somebody else's mistake, same as he always did, and the report buried it under 2 words nobody thought to question. Callie sat with that for a long moment, watching the 4 dogs at the rail, still watching her back. The late afternoon light through the loading dock doors had gone amber, catching the dust in the air, and for the first time all day the building felt less like a place things were sold, and more like a place something had finally been returned. 3 years she had told herself that not asking was respect. 3 years of being grateful in a silence that had never once been earned, resting on a version of events written by the man responsible for the thing it was hiding. She thought about how much lighter grief felt now that it had a shape she could actually hold, instead of an absence she'd been asked to fill with gratitude alone. "He died saving someone," she said, "not an accident." "He died saving someone," Denny said. "That's the whole truth of it. That's what should have been on that report from day one." The handler in the khaki vest approached slowly, leashes gathered loosely in one hand, and crouched a respectful distance from where Callie sat. "They've been asking about you for the last hour," he said, nodding toward the dogs. "Never seen them settle like this around a stranger before." "I'm not sure I'm a stranger," Callie said. She stood, crossed to the rail, and this time nobody stopped her, nobody steered her elbow toward an exit, nobody had a reason to keep her at a distance anymore. She crouched in front of the smallest one first, let it press its head into her palm, felt the warm, steady weight of it settle against her knee, then reached for the others, one at a time, 4 sets of eyes and 4 sets of ears, finally allowed to rest instead of watch. She made the sound her father used to make, the click, twice, low, not as a command this time, just as something true passed between them, and all 4 dogs settled around her at once, weight against her legs, against each other, the particular stillness of animals who had finally, after 3 years of waiting for the wrong people, found the right one. The handler watched them for a moment, then looked at Callie with something soft crossing his tired face. "Ma'am," he said, "given everything that's happened here today, would you want to adopt them? All 4 if you're able. I don't imagine they'd do well being split up now." Callie said yes before she'd fully finished hearing the question. The paperwork took another hour, but none of it felt long the way the rest of the day had. She walked out of the auction hall as the light outside had gone low and gold, long shadows stretching across the half-empty lot. 4 dogs walked beside her, off-leash, none of them inclined to go anywhere she wasn't going. Denny walked her to her car, promised to call, promised there would be hearings ahead, statements, months of paperwork still to come. She didn't mind. She had waited 3 years for a truth with a real shape. A few more months felt almost easy by comparison. She thought, driving toward the highway with 4 sets of eyes watching from the back seat, of all the other sons and daughters, somewhere still sitting with a folder they'd never opened, a silence they'd mistaken for respect. She hoped something would find them too, a sound remembered, a stranger finally brave enough to speak. The collar sat on the passenger seat now, not evidence anymore, just her father's, resting where it belonged. 4 dogs settled in as the last light dropped below the trees, and for the first time in 3 years, Callie Ransom drove home in silence that felt like peace instead of absence.